Welcome to another conversation in People in Fundraising. This podcast features interviews with nonprofit professionals who discuss their career journeys, lessons learned, and enthusiasm for working in fundraising. And here's your host, the founder of People in Fundraising, Tim Wilson.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Wilson. I'm the founder and host of this webcast series called People in Fundraising. And today is April 27th. I am delighted to welcome my longtime friend, fellow UMass-Amherst alum, and neighbor, and just an all-around great person, Rachel Fournier, to our series today. So Rachel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you. So just a quick introduction for Rachel and how we know each other. Rachel is currently a principal in foundation relations at the American Cancer Society, and she is based in the Philadelphia region of our country. So as I mentioned, Rachel and I were neighbors. We grew up in southeastern Massachusetts, one block away from each other in Bridgewater. So we've known each other since our junior high school days. And we both went to University of Massachusetts, Amherst for college. And so we've been friends for many years, and it's great to reconnect with you, Rachel. And I'm just honored to have you talk about the professional journey that you've been on as part of this series.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm delighted to join you.
Awesome. So Rachel, if you could just describe for our audience, I left it off at you graduated from UMass-Amherst, and if you could just tell us, what you majored in and how you got into the fundraising field, that would be great.
Sure, happy to. Thanks. So I majored in psychology as an undergrad at UMass-Amherst, and really went into the program and starting in third grade, really thinking I was on a psychology PhD track. And when it became time to do those applications, realized that wasn't exactly the path that I wanted to be on, and had always really had a passion for nonprofits, a lot of that coming from my background being really involved in Girl Scouting, like as a child and then high school. And so, really thinking I could make an impact, not just on sort of an individual patient to psychologist relationship, but being able to do something a little bit more macro level. And so, and also, was 22 and didn't really know. So knowing I wanted to be in nonprofits and knowing I would likely want to be a leader, I went into the Master's in Public Administration program at Suffolk University in Boston. And what was attractive about that program was they had a nonprofit management track and internship opportunities and a really strong grant writing focus as well. Okay. And so, taking those grant writing classes, I really started to see where my path might lead and what professional aspirations I might have in that area. And for me, I think, had I been independently wealthy, I would have been in school forever. Like that, sort of the hunger that I had for learning. And I think the grant writing piece for me is like writing a paper all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And I found that really attractive. And so completed that program and had great internship opportunities on the grant writing side. And then my first role out of Suffolk was actually running a research study at Harvard Medical School and working on a lot of National Institutes of Health grants. And I say that with full recognition that I was like way in over my head and didn't really know what I was doing. But the principal investigator of the research study really gave me a lot of latitude and opportunity to learn and put pieces together and work with investigators internationally and putting together proposals.
Interesting.
And so that really, I think it was a great way to start grant writing, because nothing you do after is going to be as hard as writing an NIH grant where you don't know any of the scientific content. And so I did that for a few years, and it was great. And then my husband and I, really wanted to buy a house, really wanted to start a family, and knew that at the time, living and working in Boston, neither of those things were financially possible. And so we had met a couple from Maine on our honeymoon, actually, and they kept encouraging us to move to Maine. And so we started looking for jobs, started looking for houses, and there was an opportunity at a community hospital in Central Maine to be their first ever grant writer. And kind of like build the program from the ground up. And so I was hired, I think, 3 days a week to start to build that program. And it was neat. It was a formerly Catholic hospital. And so my office was in the old chapel. So I had these beautiful stained glass windows. It was really neat. But with the condition that if I could prove myself and bring money in, it could become a full-time position. And it was really, really fun. They were entering a capital campaign to build a cancer center. And so we moved to Maine. I started that job. It became full-time. We bought the house. We had the baby. And then realized, we wanted something bigger, and we wanted to be in an area that was a little more urban, more diverse. And so that led us to Philadelphia, where we've been for 15 years. And soon after arriving here, had the second baby. And so I worked in a community hospital here as well, just outside Philadelphia, as the director of corporate and foundation relations. And that was really probably the first role that involved more face-to-face fundraising and more relationship building, and also still a lot of government grant work. And then after that, I moved to the Franklin Institute, which is Philadelphia's science museum, which is a wonderful place to work. And also, you kind of are like the coolest mom if every day is take your child to work day, and your kids can run through a museum when it's closed, and your ID card opens like access that the public doesn't have, and it's pretty cool.
That's pretty. Yes, is that the museum that you and I toured with our families?
It is.
Okay.
It is. And
it's awesome.
Really fun, and really an opportunity to work in a new setting for me, a museum setting, a setting that was so easy to bring donors into, a setting that had a lot of events. So you would do a lot of face-to-face fundraising and work, and really build those partnerships. And also a really strong focus on STEM education. And so that was a new area for me of grant writing too, having been in healthcare previously. So that was a really just fun time, fun place to be. And I had just started, so in the summer of 2015, I had been at the Franklin Institute about 4 years, and I had been recruited away to work as the head of fundraising for another organization. And I was about 3 weeks into that role when I was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. And the day I was diagnosed was the last day I ever went to work, and really knew I would be starting like full-time treatment, and didn't see how I could balance family and profession. Wasn't sure what treatment would look like or how that would affect me, and knowing that if I was more fatigued or if I was ill, I wanted all of my good days to be focused on my family and less so on work. So took about a 5-year sabbatical. I can call it a sabbatical retrospectively. At the time, I thought I was retired at 38. But have have been doing well enough and feel well enough, and the kids are self-sufficient enough, that I really started to think that I could, continue to give back professionally, and really know that I'm doing so well because of the research that the American Cancer Society has funded for decades, and as the largest nonprofit, non-governmental funder of cancer research. So, and also know that, I see patients who don't have the same access to care that I have, and I really want to make everyone have the same opportunity for good treatment outcomes like I have. And so, 2 years ago, really started thinking, I think it's time to go back to work. I think I could go back to work. And so then joined the American Cancer Society in February of 2020.
All right. That's a lot of great professional ground to cover. And before we went recording with this episode, Rachel mentioned that she may go into more of her diagnosis and how it influences her role at the American Cancer Society. So thank you for sharing all of what you have so far, and in particular, your health condition. And I'm glad to know that you're feeling well enough, and you have for the last few years, to return to work.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really rewarding, I think, thinking that my career had ended on terms that were not my own, to be able to, really come back professionally. And I think for me, this role, my scope is national. My work includes patient access to care. It includes cancer research. It includes health system partnerships. And it's really interesting to me, like, it would be hard to cobble together a background and experience that fits as well as mine does for the role that I have now. And having worked in a community hospital, having done STEM education, having been in government grants, and then now I have all of that in my portfolio, and I kind of wonder, like, oh, maybe that makes sense. What seemed like odd choices, kind of cobbling together a career, maybe actually were a trajectory that was intentional all along.
Yeah, that's interesting insight into that. Yeah, because I think, for me, I've been in one role in fundraising my entire career. I know other people either deliberately look at other positions outside of where they currently are and figure out how they will move into such and such role for whatever reason. But for you, it sounds more of a serendipitous coming together of different skill sets at different times. And I would like to just follow up really quickly about the Franklin Institute, where you mentioned having more exposure to and experience needing to engage with donors. So if you could talk a little bit about that, how you went from grant writing and felt very comfortable and it fit your skill set, to being more forward facing with the constituents who supported your nonprofit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and I think about that a lot, because I feel like for me, I didn't become extroverted until I was, 35, probably. I think that, I was definitely much more comfortable in that, kind of, you could be the grant writer in that, like, enclave, old cathedral, stained glass office, and nobody really knows who you are or what you do. Like, that felt comfortable to me. And, I could get up and give a speech if I needed to, but I was definitely much less comfortable with some of that relationship building and some of the small talk that leads to a meeting, or, making an app, or being comfortable in kind of the cultivation strategies. That to me just didn't feel as natural. And I think what the Franklin Institute, what made that more comfortable, is to be able to do it in a space that you had something to talk about. So if you were, I think a lot of what it was in the beginning was, you would hear a donor was coming, and you would, or a prospect was coming, and you would greet them, give them sort of VIP access to an exhibit, be able to walk them through the exhibit, give them that experience. And And then you had something to talk about because there was, a clear shared experience of going through an exhibit together. You could, maybe you would see children there from a Title I school on a field trip, and you could say, actually, our corporate partners support this program, and that's how these children are here. And so you could tie in what they were seeing. And I think for me, that just gave me comfort. And suddenly, it was our cocktail parties and our cultivation events and our galas that became like my favorite nights of the year.
Oh, awesome.
And I would just kind of bounce from donor to donor. And I truly valued those people. I truly had built a relationship, and I saw them as part of my network. And, and it was just a very natural relationship. And which is carried, into my current role. And I think that's something that just took a little bit for me to feel more comfortable with.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating. I really appreciated hearing that. And I think I feel a little similar to you with the introversion and the comfort of a certain role, and certainly prospect development. I engage with, I meet with the frontline staff, the development officers, executive leaders, and so forth, but I don't have much engagement beyond the people I directly support. But I feel like over the last, I don't know if it'd be quite when I was 35, maybe a little later, that I also felt kind of an internal switch to, being more extroverted. And it's a little scary, I think, because, you think this is who I am in a way. And, I think, in high school, I remember, someone signed my yearbook and maybe other yearbooks, like, you're a great kid, don't ever change. And as I've reflected on, it's a well-meaning wish, but I also feel like, people should change and develop new identities and new roles for the time of life they're actually in. And that's one reason why I've launched this project, is to reconnect with people or connect with new people, because I really am fascinated by people's stories, particularly professional stories, but as we can weave in their personal anecdotes as well, it really energizes me and rejuvenates me. So I just to go about saying that I feel some connection with you about that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think too, I think for me now, being at the American Cancer Society, there is such an authenticity of my own personal experience, my own story. And they're really, I think I've become still inherently respectful, but pretty shameless about wanting to promote the work that we're doing, because, I know from a patient perspective what more funding means. It means more treatment options. It means patients who have rides to treatment. It means, more equitable program delivery. And I think, because I feel so strongly about the mission, and because it's so personal, and because have gotten more comfortable, I think, with age. And I feel like I don't need validation that I probably needed earlier on when I was less confident. It just allows me to build relationships with much more comfort. And I really like, in the role that I have now, it's really hybrid in that, I own my own externally facing relationships. I also do all my own grant writing. So it keeps both of those elements together. So it's really, if I could have dreamt up my perfect role for this phase of my life, this is it. So it's really great. It's a great opportunity.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for sharing that. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about your emotions and the kind of thought process that went into, a few years ago, feeling physically ready, maybe mentally ready. And you mentioned your family was a time of a little more self-sufficiency with your kids. You're realizing that, this was now possible. Can you just talk about how you felt about returning to the workforce and bringing your personal connection to cancer to this position?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you, I mean, there were probably like 3 exact moments when it even entered my mind to return to a full-time professional role. I had been doing sort of after the first year of diagnosis and treatment. And so, I mean, I guess I should say with this diagnosis, you're in treatment forever. And depending on how long one treatment works, it might be that you're on weekly chemo and then that doesn't work. And then you're on chemo every 3 weeks. You might be on an oral chemo. So at the time, I was on an oral chemo. That was like 2 protocols ago. But at that time, I was on oral chemo. So I did have a lot more like time flexibility and less sort of, I don't know, invasion into my life of treatment. But we had gone to Spain as a family and in 2019. And I remember, kind of standing in a neighborhood in Madrid in the early morning and watching someone walk to work and thought like, gee, I wonder what I could do professionally so that I could live in Spain someday, or I could retire in Spain someday. And that was really the first time that I had allowed myself to think more than 6 months ahead. And so that really told me like, wow, like you're in a different place psychologically, emotionally than you have been. Like you're daring to think of longer term future. And then because we had such an amazing time in Spain, I knew that there was an every other year metastatic breast cancer conference in Portugal that one could write a grant to attend as a patient advocate and attend the conference for free and have your travel also covered. And so I went home, I wrote a proposal. It was the first time I'd written a grant for myself and was selected to attend. And, and that really got me to kind of thinking like, okay, if you can go to Portugal alone, like you could probably go to work once in a while. And so that was really like a big moment for me. And then actually that same week, so in November of 2019, I was invited by the hospital where I'm treated to be one of the speakers at their annual breast cancer conference. And as I was, giving the remarks and, I kind of had like a fairly receptive and engaged audience. And I really felt like, okay, like how could my story help other people and what could I do professionally to be able to do this more every day and have a greater impact and not have my skills and past professional history kind of be latent. So all of those things kind of came together. And so, within just 3 months, I started with the American Cancer Society. And I had actually started, I found, because I wasn't sure sort of how much stamina I had to return to full-time work. And of course, that was like just pre-pandemic. So I didn't know if I could commute and go into an office and still do all of those things and, maintain sort of life with these 2 teenagers and a husband and a dog and all of these things. And so I started as the manager of foundation relations for the Northeast. And as foundation relations at the American Cancer Society has evolved over the last 2 years, my role has also been elevated. And then this new principal foundation relations role was created just in January of this year to allow me to focus predominantly on external facing and like 6 and 7 figure plus gifts nationally. Awesome. So it's really just been, a great trajectory. And but yeah, I mean, it just was time. It was time, and this opportunity just couldn't have been more appropriate.
Oh, I'm so glad for you, Rachel. That's great.
Thanks.
That's great. With this new role, and you mentioned, you work for the national organization, American Cancer Society, and you just mentioned external audiences on a national level. I imagine you do most of your correspondence and meetings virtually anyway, is that right? So
I mean, that's how it has been. So I started the last week of February of 2020. We have just been given approval to start face-to-face meetings, to be able to travel to meetings. So definitely there will be times. I actually have a donor meeting in Baltimore next month because we're touring one of our facilities. And so that will be a face-to-face meeting. I'm speaking at our policy conference in DC in May. So that will be like a bigger audience meeting. But it is a really, I think, we live now in a world where you can build these relationships, maintain relationships, in a more virtual way. And I think that, for me, the timing has been great because I can, there are many times that I'm actually in the chemo facility, hooked up to treatment, on a Zoom call, writing a proposal, and you can actually do all of those things at the same time. And so for me, that's been, just a really, I think, big gift in order to be able to work full time and maintain what sometimes a full-time treatment schedule.
Sure. And yeah, if I can follow up on that, I imagine given the organization and the levels of treatment, the different levels of treatment and duration of treatment, I imagine they're very supportive of when you yourself need to take care of yourself.
Yeah, they couldn't be more understanding. I mean, and I would say they're much more understanding, gracious, forgiving, encouraging to me than I ever would be with myself. So often people are like, why are you working? Why are you doing that? You don't even need to use vacation time. Clearly you're otherwise engaged. I think for me, while that is very, I am appreciative of that, to me, I think it proves a lot to myself that I can do both. And I think it also is, there are so many people like me who don't have the choice. I mean, I'm really fortunate, we live within 10 miles of 3 national cancer institutes. I have a spouse with a full-time job. We have private health insurance. My kids are old enough that I don't need childcare. I think for me, I'm not, an hourly worker who's also trying to find childcare, take the bus to treatment, who doesn't have strong health insurance, who doesn't have that option. So I think for me, I feel a responsibility to do this well and to also demonstrate that you can balance things, but I recognize that I come to it from an extreme point of privilege in a really unfortunate circumstance. But I think, but yes, they're incredibly gracious and understanding.
Good.
Yeah.
If you could, we have about 10 minutes left. If you could just, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, what was it like for your family to be at the point where, mom, Keith's wife, where they were great. I'm sure they're grateful that you were to a point health-wise where you could go back to work. Did that come with any, different thoughts about what it meant for mom to go back to work full time and juggling lots of demands on time and attention?
So not really. And the reason being, I mean, I think in the years before I was diagnosed, the years I was at the Franklin Institute and the years I was commuting to a hospital that's 30 miles away, that was the time, and I had kids that were younger elementary school or even preschool. I mean, that was the time that you feel so torn. You feel like you're not doing parenting or being an employee well enough, and you're always doing both. And I think for me it was getting up at 4 a.m. and writing grant proposals before the kids got up for school, and then would go to a full-time work day. And I still, if I'm driving home from Philadelphia between 5:30 and 6, I have the anxiety of not being there in time before the after school program closes. And my kids are in high school. They haven't been in an after school program in 8 years, but there is that stress. And so I think for me to have been home for 5 years, like that were really like the upper elementary and middle school years, and to be able to like fully engage in everything that was going on with them at school, which I had been doing always, but always felt torn and guilty about it. So to be able to
Sure.
only focus on being a mom was a really sort of fortuitous timing. I mean, the cause I would never choose, but
Yeah.
being a mom and chaperoning every field trip and doing all of those things was really a valuable time. I mean, those were times that I could never recreate, and to be able to do that without feeling guilty about anything else was valuable. So I think, for me, going back to work wasn't that much of a challenge. However, it also, unfortunate but fortuitous timing, because I started in February 2020, I've been remote the entire time. My husband has also been remote almost the entire time. And so, it's, we're both here. The dog gets walked by my husband like 10 times a day. We're there to pick the kids up from school. We hear all the stories when they get home. So it really hasn't been as much of a juggle as it may have been sort of in a pre-COVID world, I think, which for me has really, the expectation of being remote permanently does really, give a lot more options, I think, for people in terms of what they're able to manage professionally and personally.
Definitely. Yeah. And has it been, or can you just describe what it's been like for you in a new job, fully remote, and you have a forward-facing portfolio with donors and prospects, but also with your internal colleagues? So what's that been like in terms of engaging and teamwork and such?
Yeah, it's interesting because I realized, so we have for the first time, well, the second time since I started, because the first week I was hired happened to be a nationwide retreat week. And so we were all together in person. And then that hasn't happened again until it's coming up in June. We'll all be together in person. And I think what was telling for me in the way we've been able to build relationships in this remote work environment is I have to really think to determine which of my colleagues I've met in person before and which ones I haven't. And maybe out of 100 nationally, I maybe have only met 10 in person, but I feel just as close to all of the others. And I think, technology has just made this so natural to be able to have these conversations and work together on teams. And I also think, this time, because so many people are working remotely, we've been able to like see glimpses of people's, non-work life even more so. And I feel like that's like accelerated the relationship building. And I feel like that in terms of donor work as well. I think we really have been able to build close relationships, tell patient stories, tell, what the impact of COVID has been on cancer patients' access and care, what that's meant in terms of like delayed diagnoses. And so, we've really, I think, become very close together because this is like almost a shared experience of what the pandemic has been and, how it's impacted people differently, but we all are living through it together. And I think, that's sort of a, like an in the trenches, you become close kind of model.
Sure. Yeah, that's good insight. Thank you. And it sounds like you've just hit the ground running in a new at the time role that coincided with the pandemic, coincided thankfully with you feeling physically, psychologically ready to have a full-time position. So I'm grateful for you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been, I mean, I'm incredibly, it's a career over. And so to be able to, use all of those professional skills, but also in a way, like because of the American Cancer Society, like really to have a platform to tell my own story and kind of do some of the advocacy work that I was doing as a volunteer anyway, is really just like a synergy of all good things, and then to be able to have managers who get to kind of see me back in my element professionally and as mom, has been, really rewarding as well. Because, they've been impacted by, all of this and my diagnosis. And, to hear them talk about, their own aspirations for careers and health policy, are really exciting. Like,
Sure.
I get it.
Yeah. That's great. Any last thoughts? Any recap you'd like to share? Anything because Rachel did quite a bit of preparing before the interview, and we talked a little bit before we went to record. Anything that we haven't covered that you would like to make sure you share?
I mean, I think just, we touched on this a little bit in the beginning, I think, in making that shift from, a more internally facing role or a more, support or operations role to like a front facing, externally facing fundraising role. And I think I would just want, your viewers to know, people who see this, that, for me, it really took like age and honestly, like this diagnosis to feel validated, to feel comfortable. And I think, I think back to that first Harvard Medical School job when I was in over my head. And I mean, I cried in the bathroom at that job probably every day. I mean, at least twice a week, but probably more like every day. And when I resigned from that role, the principal investigator, who was my supervisor, told me, like, I would hire you back in a second at any point. Like, I would always want to work with you. And I thought, like, could you have told me that once in the past 2 years? And I, for anyone who's like newly in fundraising or newly transitioning to a fundraising role, like, to be more confident, to know your worth and your value, and to ask questions of people, and you won't get it right every time, and that's okay. And you can take risks, and you might make a mistake, and just to surround yourself with people who will build you back up, and not to limit yourself and think I couldn't make, a stretch, whether it's going into a supervisory role or it's going into an externally facing role or whatever, is something that you're being led to do. Take the risk and, be confident in what you bring to the table, and not wait 10 years to feel like that would be okay for you.
Yeah, well, that's beautifully said, Rachel. I think so many people, and I can relate to that too, just the grapple of being young and ambitious, and sometimes not having a clear path for yourself, and hearing others' expectations. We had a conversation last week with Evan Gallivan at RISD, and he really talked about listening to his own expectations. Others are going to have expectations for him and for everyone with careers and suggestions, and they'll be enthusiastic. But I really liked his conversation, and yours as well, where it's listening to what you want. And sometimes it comes later, and you wish you could go back, as you said, 10 years, and wish that a supervisor had told you that great feedback earlier.
Yes.
But I like how you framed it, that, to take risks, to have more confidence in yourself. And I think there's something to be said for patience as well with career aspirations. But also, as you've demonstrated in your career, and as you shared with us today, being insightful to your skills and what skills you want to develop, where you want to go in terms of roles and positions and institutions. So I'm just very grateful to have had you on our webcast series today, Rachel. And thank you for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and it's great to catch up and get to know each other professionally.
Absolutely. Yeah, Rachel and I were joking a little bit earlier that we know each other very well. I mentioned her husband's name at one point in this conversation, and my family visited her family a few years ago, one summer, So we knew a lot about each other personally, and I think we're both chuckling because I admitted before we started recording that after UMass-Amherst, I wasn't quite sure, what has comprised Rachel's career. I knew she was at Franklin and a few other nonprofits to the American Cancer Society, but there was a gap professionally in my knowledge. So thank you very much, Rachel. And my heartfelt best to you and your family for all good things. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Tim.
And for our listeners, you can find Rachel's terrific conversation on our website, peopleinfundraising.com, as well as the other recorded interviews in this series. So thank you for listening, and we will have more guests coming up in the next few weeks. And again, Rachel, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.